Good afternoon, and welcome to our book talk for this afternoon about man and God and law with Stephen Daniel Arnoff. Before we officially introduce him, a little bit about who is sponsoring today's program and upcoming events. Our book talks are sponsored by Congregation B'nai Shalom, the Contra Costa JCC under 110 program, in partnership with the Jewish Book Council and Diablo Valley Hadassah. And we thank all of our sponsors for making this event possible. And now, who is our author today? Stephen Daniel Arnoff, as it is written in his bio, quote, illuminates the intersection of rock and roll and religion, offering both the casual and the committed a new gospel of popular culture. We don't usually find that, so we're very interested in knowing more. Born in Ohio, he has performed in clubs for decades and holds a doctorate in Midrash scripture interpretation. He lives in Jerusalem, where he is COO of the Fuchsberg Jerusalem Center, after having served in leadership roles at the 92nd Street Y, the 14th Street Y, and Shalom College. And now it is our great pleasure to introduce Stephen Arnoff. Thank you.
Thank you, Riva. Thank you all for coming. And I appreciate joining you under one tent. We just met, but here we are, all under one tent. I'm going to share with you some of the headlines, principles, highlights of a book I've written, as Riva mentioned, called About Man and God and Law, The Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan. And for about 30 minutes or so, I'll be sharing those highlights, and then we'll have a chance for some conversation. If you have questions, I'm delighted to try to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I'm sure that one of you can answer some of the questions. So I hope that you're someone who's somewhere in the nexus of interest between music and Judaism or spirituality, a little bit of history. The book really does try to synthesize a lot of different interests through the lens of Bob Dylan, which makes sense because much of what makes Bob Dylan's music and persona and model for culture so interesting and important is because it does synthesize so many different things. So we'll take a look at that, take a glimpse at that. And if you want more, I encourage you to consider purchasing the book, which you can do wherever fine books are sold, as we say. So I'm going to line up the old magical Zoom screen here. And I don't want you to feel that we're in a corporate environment because I'm using a PowerPoint. Also, there is, Riva, I believe, no exam at the end of this session. But if you are going to have an exam, that has nothing to do with me. I have not asked anyone to have an exam. That's the cover of the book. Maybe you know it. And this word comes right after the cover of the book, prophet. So I'm reflecting with you about themes through the lens of Bob Dylan, through the lens more broadly of rock and roll, which have traditionally been applied to sacred text. To think about prophecy in the realm of sacred texts like the Bible, sacred texts as they come down through time, all the way through yesterday, for those of you who following Kiddush, watch the coronation of the king, you'll see that so much of the tradition that we experience in our world is generated by religion. The service of bringing forward the king and anointing the king reads a lot like both the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as it's called, and the New Testament. This idea of looking for the sacred in our leaders, in our purpose, in our experience of the world, has been what people have been doing for many, many, many thousands of years. Something happened not so long ago where we conceived of a world where there was such a thing as secular culture. Culture for culture's sake, art for art's sake. Creativity didn't serve a religious master, but rather served the urge or the muse of the artist. Obviously, terminologies like muse and urges of the artists have been around as long as there have been artists, but the primary supporter and the primary narratives or mythologies that the arts shared were either historical or religious stories. Even to think of William Shakespeare, who might be in some ways the first truly global secular artist, was using religious and political texts as the canvas which he painted with. I know that's a mixed metaphor, but in terms of what was the palette that an artist like William Shakespeare used, he used the inherited traditions of the sacred or the political, but certainly illuminated by the sacred, to tell stories that were about the things that we all want to hear about in our stories, which is love, violence, longing, sex, power, our search for meaning, our search for ourselves. All of those themes are the themes of Dylan. He comes of age in the era, the golden age of rock and roll, and he would never call himself a prophet. He would not call himself, as the phrase goes, the son of a prophet, but he is dealing with the same raw materials that prophets, seers, sages of a religious inclination have always dealt with. And really, that's the main theme of the book. How does it come to be that the world needs a voice like Dylan, that it needs a mode where popular culture, in this case rock and roll, but it's not only limited to rock and roll, but where popular culture actually serves spiritual purpose, in many ways, for many people, replacing religion with the cult of music, with the meaning seeking of music, with the way that rock and roll helps people make sense of the world, music helping people create a soundtrack of meaning for their lives and a window into what religion has always wrestled with. So the theme of a prophet is not meant to present Dylan as a prophet, but meant to present Dylan as a embodiment of the same kinds of traits and trends that have always animated lives of the sacred, life of the sacred. And Dylan plays with this theme, even if he would never accept himself as being chosen like that. He does say, and this comes from his most recent album of new material, though he just came out with a album of re-recorded original material. This is new material from the album Rough and Rowdy Ways, where he says, I'm the enemy of treason, I'm the enemy of strife, I'm the enemy of the unlived, meaningless life. I ain't no false prophet, I just know what I know. I go where only the lonely can go. So if we had more time and you had more patience, I'm not saying that you don't have patience, but I'm just guessing spending a whole hour on just that verse might get a little stale. But for me, it almost encapsulates the key themes of the canon of Dylan, the key themes of the book that I've written and the teaching that I do around this particular artist, that Dylan sees himself as living a life which is the antithesis of meaninglessness. This is what philosophers and seekers of the spirit and of truth have always done. They have wanted to find meaning. They don't accept a vacuum of meaning. And so much so that it's almost like a war of life or death. It would be treason. It would be treason not to seek out what it is all about. Now, Dylan plays with parallelisms and double negatives and all kinds of riddle-like encoded language to try to create sometimes a feeling or maybe an experience that he's saying more than he is. So a phrase like, I ain't no false prophet. I just know what I know. I go where only the lonely can go. So when he says, I ain't no false prophet, I'm not a false prophet, which is a double negative way of saying, in a colloquial way, I am a prophet, but I'm not really a prophet because I just know what I know, just like a normal person. You know, I know what I know. I go where only the lonely can go. The lonely are alone. So the only place that a lonely person can go is a place where they're the only person who understands something. So there's this play with knowing something that no one else knows because you're perhaps a prophet, but knowing that just because you're a prophet who knows what only you know does not make you different than anyone else, because he just knows what he knows, just like you know. But also, on top of that, or layered upon that, he can only go where only he knows where to go. And for all of us, ultimately, loneliness might be beyond the tangible, physical manifestations of threat or disease or whatever we face in the world. Loneliness may be the hardest thing that anyone ever has to deal with. So it's just an example of the mix of how, in a kind of secular, colloquial language, Dylan is mixing in some very, very big questions, psychological questions, spiritual questions, social or sociological questions. It's all in those 3 lines in that 3rd verse. And then if we skip ahead to the 6th verse, he says, I've searched the world over for the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail, of course, I mentioned the coronation. When we think of the tales of the Holy Grail, tales of the knights seeking out this impossible mission to find what is essentially the connection back to Jesus of Nazareth, the connection back to sacredness, the crusade, the mission. It's part of popular culture. Many of us read King Arthur in 7th grade. I don't know if they still do. I did. Maybe you did. So popular myth, King Arthur seeking out the Holy Grail, that's all present for us. It's just kind of part of the popular language, popular tongue. To look for the Holy Grail, you could say that an announcer could say that in a football game, that the searching for that quarterback who's going to help them find the Holy Grail. But at the same time, Dylan harkens back to something ancient. And what is he doing? He's harkening back to something that's ancient and holy. So it's colloquial, it's the vernacular. He's saying, I'm just an ordinary guy, but he's also saying, I'm on a quest for something that only I can understand that really is holy. And one could say that's a lot of weight to put on a song in 2021 when the song was released, a lot of weight to put on a guy who still likes to travel the world, wearing a cowboy suit and singing songs, some of which he wrote 60 years ago. But because Dylan has been pounding the boards of stages across the world for 60 years, and because he has probably the most covered songs of his generation and is by far the most influential musician in his genre, it's worth taking the lyrics seriously. It's worth taking the persona seriously. And really, if anything, would encourage you to take a look at the book or think about some of its themes. It would be this: where in the secular vernacular does the pursuit of the sacred come in? And what does it mean in terms of when it comes in, how it comes in, and why it comes in? This guy might know. is not Dylan's rhythm guitarist for the first part of the 2000s. This is Max Weber, a late 19th, early 20th century sociologist of religion, who actually said in his study of major religions of the world, not limited to the monotheistic traditions, but he spent the most time on Christianity and Judaism. He said that the modern society, and he comes from Germany, and he lived through the impact of the Industrial Revolution and the pangs of nationalism, and his lifetime intersected with the lead up to the First World War. He saw the breakdown in the structure whereby the church really holds cultural sway upon the world, and in the combination of text, tradition, ritual, superstition, whatever it is that religion brings, there was an emergent social structure that was secular, that didn't want to depend on religion. It might have wanted to depend on the religion of nationalism. But ultimately, Weber said, all movements have a religious sensibility. All culture in some way is generated from a search for meaning. All individuals in some way, or all societies in some way, are asking the question of what it means to live a meaningful or meaningless life, as Dylan mentioned in the first song that we looked at. And Dylan was in some sense kind of a gleam in Max Weber's eye, even if he was writing 50 years before Dylan released his first music, when he said that somewhere in the mix of the secular and the sacred worlds and the struggle that would take place between them, it could be that new prophets would emerge. And in some sense, the world of rock and roll represents a kind of vernacular prophecy, a kind of reemergence of asking of the questions of meaning and purpose, which had animated religion for millennia. And that was Max Weber's thesis, which I think Dylan sort of demonstrates comes true. Now, in order for Dylan to reach that place, a few things needed to happen culturally, and one of them is not. This is not a picture of a 1953 Messiah riding into town on his white horse on a black motorcycle. I'm not sure which motorcycle he's riding. I'm not an expert. He's blocking it. That's Marlon Brando. It's a studio still from The Wild One. If you remember the movie, the most famous scene, I think, from The Wild One is when Brando's character Johnny comes into a like a biker bar, like a roadhouse, and he's with his buddy, and of course, because it's a Hollywood film of that time, they run into two women, a woman that he's interested in, her buddy, and she says, what are you rebelling against? Great question in 1953. And his answer is, what have you got? Which doesn't just beg the answer or the definition that comes not long after that from James Dean in the film Rebel Without a Cause. So Johnny's a rebel for sure. You can see that, right? This would pass for rebel garb even today, Marlon Brando. And James Dean would probably pass in his rebel guard today as well. And for Dylan, both Marlon Brando and James Dean were heroes. They were really two personas that really sort of helped him and his friends shape what was cool. But they're very incomplete as seekers of meaning. Brando says, as Johnny, I am a rebel without a cause. When he's asked what he's fighting against, what he's rebelling against, he's just rebelling. He doesn't say, I'm rebelling against misogyny. I'm rebelling against the mistreatment of people of color. I'm rebelling against anti-Semitism. I'm rebelling against nuclear armament. I'm rebelling against any number of social ills that just 10, 12, 15 years later are the guts of what popular culture is interested in being a rebel with a cause. And that's where Dylan comes in. So if you sort of imagine historically, and you can go very far back with this, but imagine historically, sort of from the time that Weber is describing a breakdown in the balance between, or there wasn't a balance. Religious culture really was dominant. And that's a breakdown that takes place over centuries, but he really puts his finger on it at the end of the 19th century. And imagine that sort of the plates are shifting under the foundation of what makes societies what defines them. Brando is part of a generation that says, like the band Twisted Sister would say, 30 years later, we're not going to take it. We're not going to take it. Like James Dean would present a rebel without a cause, a breakdown, a dissatisfaction. That generation turned to spirituality as much as it turned to religion. And that's a whole other talk. But you can say unequivocally that a big part of what made the generation of music that Dylan represents is a pursuit of finding a cause for rebellion. Rebelling for what? Not just to rebel, which was part of it for sure, but also towards something. So one of the things that's important to remember about Dylan, and I include this because he said this in San Francisco, so it's just across the bridge from some of you, I bet. This famous press conference in San Francisco, where Dylan, who in 1965 was already at the age of 24, almost 25, sort of spinning the world on his finger in terms of culture. Obviously, the Beatles are the beloved musicians of all time in so many ways, and in many ways so much easier to understand, and also they get off the hook because, well, the Beatles break up at the end of the 60s and the legend lives on. Dylan is still performing probably tonight somewhere in the world. Dylan refuses, as much as he talks about the most serious things, to allow himself to be taken seriously or put into a category that would calcify his very iconoclastic, very rebel with a cause persona. When the reporter asks, you can read, I know your readers out there, you've already read this. I won't read it for you. But when he's asked how many singers toiled in this musical vineyard, the one that I'm describing, the vineyard of the rebels with a cause, and he's asked how many. In other words, is this a thing? Is this a movement? And Dylan just makes fun of the question by saying, I think there's 136, 142, not sure. And it's the role of humor and cynicism and certain kind of sarcasm that is one of the many masks that Dylan used. He was very funny in the early part of his career, known to be just a very funny performer. He still loves jokes. A friend of mine just sent me a joke that someone in his band reported he had been telling. It's a joke about a royal family of potatoes. You can look it up. I will share it with you if there's great demand after these opening comments. But the use of humor, the ability to misdirect praise or definition concerning what he does is a very important part of him being the person who can both bridge a gap where spiritualism prophecy, quest for greater meaning seeps into the foundation of quote unquote secular culture. And at the same time, he can say, I ain't no false prophet, and get away with it. Dylan has, he's had quite a run over the past 2.5 decades, and really unprecedented in terms of an artist of his age, and he's 82 this month on May 24th. It's unprecedented that he performs as much as he does, releases music as much as he does. There are other artists who are still doing it. Willie Nelson is still doing it. Paul McCartney is still doing it. But in terms of doing work that is really challenging and is seen as still got that edge of threat and is unexpected, as late as 2021 with the release of the album that I mentioned, where a false prophet appears, Rough and Rowdy Ways. Dylan is still dangerous in his 80s. And, we should all merit to still be dangerous in our 80s. But this line from this song, Sugar Baby, which comes from a few years earlier, is one that I come back to a lot in thinking about Dylan. It's in the first verse, I got my back to the sun because the light is too intense. I can see what everybody in the world is up against. You can't turn back. You can't come back. Sometimes we push too far. One day you'll open up your eyes and you'll see where we are. So this same artist who, in the initial song that I shared from False Prophet, talked about being a person who goes where only the lonely can go. He's got this special gift, this special vision, this special understanding, and yet it leaves him lonely. He is, I'm sure, very difficult to be around and arrogant in his way, and rock stars are rock stars. But there is a deep kind of sympathy. I'd like to think of it as a kind of empathy, in which he continually comes back to using a word that our English teachers told us not to, which is you, right? You're not you. You're not supposed to use you in an essay. That's to use that second person singular or plural you is seen to be a little bit lazy when you're writing expository work, when you're trying to explain something. Try to avoid it. I just did it twice. But the you in Dylan, and we see this a lot in his book that he just released called Philosophy of Modern Song. He is over and over and over again throughout his career, as inner-directed as his lyrics and thinking are, something that drove his initial fans nuts when he quote unquote went electric from the sort of protest songs, historical songs about social justice, songs about bringing together people around a cause. And when he stopped pointing at the world, what was wrong with the world, and started pointing at himself and asking what's wrong with him, or what is in his heart, he did not become narcissistic any more than your average rock star might become narcissistic, which is probably pretty narcissistic, but nonetheless, they earn it the hard way. But the message that I hear over decades of music is, I am singing this song so that you, audience, can experience something of you, for you, by you. The reason why he's got his back to the sun and because the light is too intense. Because he is brave enough to look at the sun, not dumb enough like a certain president who wouldn't wear the special glasses during an eclipse some time ago. But he's got this vision where he can see the light and it's too intense, so he has to turn from it. Not unusual for a prophet or an artist or a seer to see too much of the light, and it can make them crazy, or it can damage them, or they just need to turn away from it. But what he can see in his quote unquote greatness as an artist, as a seer, as a prophet, is something that everyone should see or know about. Something about loneliness, something about dissatisfaction, something about brokenheartedness, something about just the garden variety challenges of life, of being a person. And that the job of music is to help people open up their eyes and see where they really are. So, and this brings us back to the theme of prophecy, which is where I'll sort of share a closing thought before we get to some questions. I chose to start with the term prophet because in the popular imagination, we often think of prophets as being these kind of crazed, long-bearded Armageddon yellers, right? Who are saying, you're all going to go to hell. And time is near, berating people to serve God or the religious authority before it's too late, and that we think of prophets as being really angry, and there's definitely a lot of angry prophets in the text, but the real role of the prophet to be a navi is to put people on the right track. They're sort of there as a force to try to create alignment between whatever the holy source is and the actual lives of people. They're there to try to help people shed some light on their life. They're there to try to enlighten people. They're there to try to show people the way. And in this sense, if we remove some of the trappings of the long beard and the old man and Armageddon and some of the cliches that we bring to religion, unfortunately, and think of a prophet as someone whose job is to help people be and see where they really are, this is what music did and does. It is a way that a very talented person can take their gifts to see perhaps a little more or a little differently or a little deeper than we could in our lives, because that's not our job, and bring it back in a way that we can see it and hear it as well. This is what prophets, priests, seers, sages, clerics did. Too often that was tied up with different kinds of power, and we live in a different world now. And thankfully, we live in a world where, in traditions that I would consider, legit, women and men mix freely in the leadership roles, and there really is a opportunity for a diverse religious voice of tradition. That was not always the case. It was certainly not the case if you grew up in the major religions where Dylan grew up in North America. And while it's often the case today, it's not always the case. It was not assumed. So this idea that music came to try to help people see things that they needed help seeing, which are ancient and important, is, to my mind, amongst the many contributions that Dylan makes and amongst the many contributions I talk about in the book, it's one that's really important to pay attention to, because Dylan ain't going to be around all that much longer. Music will be, and we really need to think about how we value and encourage creative people to shape messages for themselves and for others that are generative and that provide more light to see the world and to see where we really are. And that is the story of the book about man and God and law, spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan. It's thematic. It goes through Dylan through the lens of 8 or 9 key themes, and then tries to surmise what it means and where it's coming from and where it's going, both for Dylan, but also for those of us who care so much about music, especially rock and roll. That's what we're talking about, Riva.
Okay, thank you. You can stop sharing. We can ask
Okay.
people to write their questions with the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Just type it in. Was very insightful. Thank you so much. One question, which I think is on plenty of people's minds. What do you make of Dylan's conversion to Christianity at one point? And where is he now religiously?
What do I make of it? Well, you remember the movie Airplane? Remember in the movie Airplane where they're going crazy in the tower because the plane's going down, and the guy comes up and he holds him the newspaper. He says, what do you make of this? And he says, well, I can make a hat. I can make a brontosaurus. I can make, right. So I can make, I can make a hat. What I make of it is that, the chances of me getting into my own mind and knowing what I really was thinking when I made certain decisions is slim, but into the mind of someone else, limited beyond belief. From what we know about Dylan's life, it makes all the sense in the world that a person who was drawn to particularly Black music, gospel music, who was at the time he got really involved in Christianity, dating a Black gospel singer who's a very religious person. And also there was some other influencers around him. Culturally, it makes sense that someone who was that vested in the New Testament to take it to one conclusion and to get caught up in it, on a very human level. He'd gone through a crushing, very public divorce. He'd been to the top of the mountain of culture more than once. He had been called both the Antichrist and the Messiah for much of his career. And he just let his imagination take him there. And so, it's a human story of a person who was in a lot of pain and found what he thought would be relief for it and an answer. And, there's a reason why Christianity has been so successful in gathering billions of people to follow, because it's powerful stuff. It's not for me, but I've studied the texts, and I have colleagues who are spiritual leaders in different varieties of Christian churches, and it's powerful stuff. And it was powerful stuff for Dylan. He is not, in my mind, someone who brings the same kind of nuance to his explanation of his religious practice that he brings to the other kinds of thinking that he does. He seems to tend towards fire and brimstone religious philosophy as a practitioner of religion, even though his descriptions of spiritual struggle tend to leave a lot of room for a lot of different kinds of people with a lot of different kinds of beliefs. He never totally renounced his belief system that kind of blew up in the late 70s and was very prominent for 3 or 4 years. But he also, he visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's been on the Chabad telethon. He goes to synagogue. His, kids went to Hebrew school. So he's just like us in that sense as well. It is, to me, frustrating but not unexpected that an American artist would have a kind of a fundamentalist urge within. I think that there is something there. Fundamentalism is growing around the world, including in North America. And what is appealing about it is that it gives answers. Usually those answers are based on who you're better than or who you should hate, and why you're special, which for me is not a very compelling reason to be religious, but it does work. So it's a frustrating challenge for someone who loves Dylan to think about, like, well, what is he really saying in his practice? The comfort is that he leaves tons of space for other kinds of ways to be at the same time. So the parable is not explained.
Mary Wood has a question, but we don't see the whole question in the chat. She writes, where is law in your total? And then it ends.
I meant title.
Where's law? God-in-law. Yeah.
My second question was the difference between a prophet who talks to an individual. It's not exact. I can't phrase it as a question. You're talking more, in my mind, about someone addressing an individual. Of course, rock is a big medium, and you as a group, and you as a yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the difference between him as a prophet to a society, like he was in Masters of War and earlier protest songs, and a prophet to an individual?
Well, the truth for someone who believes they have the truth doesn't matter if it's for one person or a million people. The way it's manifest will be different. When he sings, you got a lot of nerve to say you are my friend. When I was down, you just stood there grinning. That seems to be directed at a person, but it could also be directed at journalists or fellow musicians or fans. It's hard to say. It really works as both.
Mm-hmm.
When he sings "You Angel You," he's singing to a woman. We're not sure which one, but it seems to be directed at one. When he says in Sugar Baby, where we really are, he could be speaking to everybody. Mm-hmm. So I think that the way that great text works is that it's strong enough to say something unique, but pliable enough to be heard in lots of different ways. And that's what sacred text is. I mean, to me, there's sacred text which is very in your face, prescriptive text, and there's sacred text that is a riddle, and beautifully done, but a riddle. I have a podcast. I'm just finishing an episode. I've done 3 seasons. I think I've done about 35 shows. They relate to the Dylan themes. And so my second to last show is going to be Dylan's 10 Commandments. So I tried to take what I thought were the 10 most important values that I found in the music and play it back. And they're very universal. They do not involve they're very universal. They do not involve milk and meat, right? They do not involve keep the Shabbat. They do not involve religious law in the classic sense, because it's just it doesn't seem to be within Dylan's rubric to do that. He is speaking to the masses. He does speak to the masses. He wanted to speak to the masses. He wanted to be a star. He likes selling records. He likes people reading his books. He wants to perform. He wants to be in front of people. This is the meaning of his life. And so, whatever he's coming up with, it is probably, I would say, 98% of the time, the songs are about specific things and people in his life that he's thinking about. And that the same 98% of the time they could apply to almost anybody. And that's the beauty of a great artist.
So music is really the medium of prophecy now.
What's that?
Music can be the medium of prophecy now.
Well,
That's
that's above my pay grade.
Oh,
But yeah, but I think that the raw material that encourages prophecy and that encourages people to want to be around or listen to or affiliate with prophets, it is the same raw material in the world of the great artists. The difference is that Paul Simon is not saying to you, you must keep Shabbat. You may not pick up sticks during the Holy Sabbath or you will be struck down. He's not interested in that kind of religious law. He's interested in how it feels. He's interested in what it means. And frankly, that's a lot more Christian than it is Jewish.
yes.
Judaism really cares about the fundamentals. It cares what you do on Shabbat. It cares what you eat. It cares about 613 mitzvot. It is not just about love. It is about specific activities that you do in order to align yourself with the divine. And that is, I must say, music that's about 613 mitzvot, to me, is just not that interesting usually. That's not what I want from my music. I want meaning from my music. I want to be moved by my music. I don't want to be told what to do.
Where are your podcasts? Last question. Where are your podcasts?
Oh, wherever podcasts are found, just Google my name, Stephen Arnoff, or About Man and God and Law, and it's on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, everywhere.
So we have two more questions. What is your opinion about his paintings? The writer says that she has recently seen them on a cruise ship.
Yeah. Well, the esteemed questioner, Judy Udoff, I'm very happy to see you here, Judy. It's nice that you could attend. And it's a great question too. I'm not saying that just because I know you ask great questions. I had a chance to see a sort of retrospective of Dylan's, the largest retrospective of Dylan's paintings in Miami, actually, maybe a year ago. And I'm not a painter. I do have a musical background. I don't have a background as a painter, so I don't really have the technical skills to talk about the paintings from that perspective. What I found, I found a lot in common with Dylan's book, the Philosophy of Modern Song, and sort of like the landscape that he's using in the paintings. It does feel like very the themes are cliche type themes, it's like sort of like listening to the same Tom Waits album over and over again. At a certain point, it's like everything takes place in a bar or a seedy hotel or with like this beautiful landscape of the West. So like there seems to be like certain patterns of topics that he chooses over and over again, which some people might find dull. what I found incredible about it was that this exhibition, it did include drawings from way back, but most of the paintings were done over the past, I guess, 5 to 7 years. And there are so many. So this man, who also does metal structure and writes books and plays about 100 live shows a year and is now releasing an album every 2 to 3 years, just keeps working. And this is what I found, and maybe this is not a position from a critic. This is just a position as a human being who's saying that's very, very inspiring to me, to think that he, like Paul Simon, who's releasing an album which is inspired by the Book of Psalms, he says, or Leonard Cohen, who worked up until his last days. Artists who just keep working and keep caring and keep producing work. I just find that incredibly powerful. And it also, I think, is telling that for an artist like Leonard Cohen, for Dylan, I don't think he's in the league, but John Cougar Mellencamp, where drawing and painting becomes very important to them. I think it also shows that for rock artists, you have to find something that goes beyond that, because rock and roll is kind of 3 chords in the truth, as they say. And so I'm just glad that, he has that outlet. And I'm not sure what I would think about it if I didn't have the music in my head when I'm looking at the paintings. But because I know it's Dylan, I spent the whole day there and had a great time.
I want to thank you so much. I want to thank you so much, Stephen.
Sure.
Our book talk authors through the Jewish Book Council do not charge an honorarium, and therefore we really strongly suggest that people think about purchasing their book for their own library as a gift. Mother's Day's coming up. Maybe you have a relative, who cares about gender, who loves Dylan, and also for your synagogue or day school library. Stephen, again, thank you.
Thank
the book's
you.
name is about man and God and law, available at bookstores and online. And everyone, thank you very much for joining us. And great job, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Been up
Thanks,
late
everyone.
in Jerusalem because he's
Yeah.
where he's speaking from. Bye,
That's right.
everyone.
Okay,
See
thanks.
you at Under One Tent.